Hello, everybody. It's Argent, and I am here with nice meme Friar. And he's come on, and we're going to talk about a bunch of different stuff today. We're going to talk about World War II, uh, Hindu nationalism, specifically the famine and that kind of thing. But yeah, so before we start, I just wanted to plug the podcast. It's Isilidor's Shack. It should be in the there should be a link to it in the chat. It's a really good Tolkien podcast, I'd say. As they put,
Yeah, and recently we have, well, our latest episode is part of our plan to diversify to cryptid stuff. So we had SERP and Mythic on last week, where we spoke at length about UFOs, liminal beings, and cryptids more generally. So you will probably enjoy episode 3, um, on the line, as they say, or in the pipe or in the oven.
do you think you're going to do a supernatural cryptids episode?
Yeah. Well, I don't know how many of your listeners know Airmite, but Airmite and I, we are planning an episode on Sinistrari and demoniality. So basically, Genesis 6, uh, the
Like Nephilim?
the yeah, yeah, the Anunnaki, yeah, the Watchers and all of that stuff. So yeah, so we'll be talking a bit about Michael Heiser on that episode. So that should come out in about a couple of weeks, couple of weeks time, or maybe next week. So yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, he is. We have no idea who he's like. I mean, there's pages upon pages of serious Tolkien scholarship on the issue. So you know it's not just us bunch of retards who talk about it. So yeah, there's probably academic articles published on it. Who? Us, or are
You
you talking?
personally came up with the only good explanation I've ever heard.
Oh, that is Charles Coulomb.
The other explanation you came up with.
Oh, that he in some way may reflect the music of the Ainur.
Yeah, he's the embodiment of the music of creation.
Yeah. So this is one of the theories that's been going around. It's not exactly mine. So Terlian and I, we agree that that's the most likely possibility.
I
So
don't know if it's true, but it's the only one I've heard that makes sense.
it's the only one I have come across that makes sense. And yeah, it's one of those things, right? I mean, we don't know what it is, but it's the only one that works, so we just go with it, really.
Right. Okay, so maybe to start off with, so maybe you could just tell me. So, from my understanding, in the role of India in World War II isn't something I am super knowledgeable about, but maybe you could tell me, like within India, what the historiography is.
So the funny thing is, right, India between 1939 and 1945 um, saw the largest volunteer or all volunteer army being formed in the history of history. So that's 2.5 million men mobilized. Um, and they served with distinction in most of the theaters, particularly in the Far East theater and in North Africa, and also in Italy, unless I'm mistaken. Now, you'd expect, right? That um, that a contribution as large and totally voluntary, so there wasn't conscription or anything of the sort. 2.5 million men just volunteered to join the British Indian Army. You would expect that this would be a thing regarding which Indians would feel pride, right? Like you would naturally expect that. However, there so far as so far as popular consciousness goes, India's participation in the Second World War is it's just been memory hold. No one talks about it. No one has any idea that we sent 2.5 million men. No one has any clue. People do not care, and it wasn't even taken up by academics until fairly recently. So there's Yasmin Khan, who wrote a book. She's at Oxford. So um, she's one of the first popularizers of um, of India's role in the Second World War. More recently, there's been Kaushik Roy. There's been bunch of other people, some Ranganathan fellow, um, and yeah. So when I say recently, I mean after the year 2000. Now, it goes without saying that the Indian military establishment does, in fact, remember that their ancestors, that their divisions and regiments formed were raised and were participating basically globally between 39 and 45. So that memory, it hasn't been lost in the Indian military establishment. But so far as popular knowledge goes, it's just a you would draw a blank. Most people have no idea. Now, this is something I wanted to work on, and it's something that I probably will work on once my post grad degree is done. So yeah, it's not for any lack of official documentary sources that that this huge lacuna in the historiography exists, but it exists, and well, there we go. It falls to us to do something about it, I expect.
Right. So the only thing I've ever what are they called? The Chimbats? Uh
The Chindits
yeah, the
under
Chindits in
yeah,
Burma I've heard of.
yeah,
The only thing I've ever heard Indian people say about World War II is "ma British induced famine."
yeah.
So am I correct in thinking there's this like idea in India? Well, we can talk about the broader idea because I've heard this line that India had a famine every year the British occupied it until 1947, and then they just didn't have them anymore. But during World War II, that there was like a British induced famine in India. Maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Okay, so oh my god, where do I begin? Okay, so
Am I wrong in like thinking that that's the narrative?
well, there is a lot of blame transfer,
Mm-hmm.
um, because no newly nationalist, no newly established nationalist government wants to say that, it was our people on the ground who fucked up the supply
Oh, okay.
issue,
So I'm looking at
and
it.
that it wasn't.
So I think I'm referring to the Bengal famine of 1943.
Yeah, yeah,
Is the one? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. That's the one. So a lot of people in India, they don't want to take responsibility for it, but there it is. So I don't think it makes much sense to blame Churchill for it, because I think what led you to plan this episode was when you brought up Madhusri Mukherjee's book. It's called Churchill's Secret War. The it's basically a super sensationalist history that just takes Churchill's private correspondence and private remarks that he made to Leo Emery out of context. Basically ignores the entirety of the context of the Second World War that was i- being fought, and there were many millions of people dying, and they just and this lady, she just says, oh, my Churchill did this, my Churchill did that. So
Does she deny that like Japan played any role in it?
um so in her book, you basically have to go through like one fourth of the way, so about 25% of the way through. Only then does Japan come up, and it's only in passing, right?
Right.
It's as if the war wasn't being fought. Now, I don't blame her. Okay, don't blame her. She has no training as an historian. She trained as a physicist, and she was a journalist for Scientific American. So we know what journalists are like, and we know how they want to feel important. So
Science
once
journalists
in a
are
while,
I don't know if you would you say they're particularly bad.
um, there's this, there's this. Well, I mean, so we have Professor Challenger, right, from Arthur Conan Doyle.
Hmm.
We have Professor Challenger saying that there's no breed of human as despicable and as disgusting as a journalist, and I'm inclined to agree. And I am a broad minded man. I draw no distinctions between science journalists or celebrity journalists or political journalists.
Right.
I, if I see a journalist, I kick that journalist. So, but yeah, so as I was saying, this lady, she basically writes what amounts to historical gossip, and that isn't good history. Okay,
Right.
that isn't good history. She has a very vague idea of how causality works, especially in a context as complicated as the Second World War, and at a time when instantaneous communication was not possible, right? There's this one thing that a lot of people in these in the business of blaming Churchill for things will um, ignore, right? It's that communication wasn't nearly as streamlined as it is now. So you see this all you see this all the time. You saw it between 2016 and 2020, right? When people were saying, oh, but why doesn't Trump do this, but why doesn't Trump do that, but why doesn't he do X, but or why did he do Y? Now, people in power, they have a lot of things to do, right?
Right.
Their their calendars are packed from beginning to end, right? And they do not have the luxury, they don't have the time to go through um, data sets. They do not have the time or the chance to review raw data. So they have people whom they have delegated to do it for them. And as the distance increases, so does noise. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so if you are so suppose you are receiving news from from, let's say, a place that's 1000 miles away from London, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, even now the prime minister wouldn't receive the news directly. Sure, he can open up his Twitter and just see what the people are saying or how it's happening, or get a live drone feed. But this was the 1940s. So you would have people 1000 miles away at this local news station who would make a preliminary report that would then get drafted into a condensed telegraphic form that would then be bounced over several radio stations, and then that would reach the prime minister's office, and then in that chancery it would be edited and monitored and censored, and perhaps it would end up never reaching the prime minister, or it would or the piece of information would reach the prime minister in such a garbled form that it it would bear no resemblance to the actual situation on the ground. So so the farther back in time you go, the more noise is introduced in a particular piece of information in the course of its transmission from its place of origin to its ultimate destination. Now, one of the one of the one of the things that happened, okay, one of the things that happened in the course of the Bengal famine was Churchill, right?
Mm-hmm.
He didn't get the information that he needed. He didn't get the information as it was generated um, at the place of the event.
Right.
Okay. In any case, in the 1940s, Churchill's role in the war cabinet was one of broad oversight rather than micromanagement. So it's just idiotic to think that he would have had a minute influence on 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 how the relief work would be carried out in Bengal. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's just one issue. That's just one issue. So it wasn't until, say, 4th of August 1943 that Churchill's war cabinet, you know, realized how widespread and how enormous the famine situation was in Bengal, and they immediately cleared 150,000 tons of Australian and Middle Eastern grain to be dispatched to Bengal, and we have records of Churchill himself insisting on the 24th of September, if my notes are correct, um, that, quote, something must be done, unquote. Now, there's this myopic idea on full display in um, in Madhusri Mukherjee's book that um, the Indians were the only ones suffering, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you know, Churchill himself said that the Indians are not the only people who were starving in the war.
Well,
You have to
China
keep in
had a
mind
much worse famine, didn't they?
China had a much worse famine, and when Russia, when the Soviet Unions lost the Ukraine, they basically lost much of their food supply.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was basically lend lease that prevented a famine of similar proportions in in the Soviet Union.
Because
So
from my understanding, they offered to open a second front earlier, but they would have had to cut land lease, and Stalin was very adamant that he would rather continue to be like the only land power in Europe fighting Germany,
yeah,
provided. Well, I guess there was Italy, Italian front, but that he would rather they keep sending food and other stuff.
let's not. Well, I mean, if we leave Bengal aside for a second, most of the high octane uh, petroleum supplies that the Soviet Union needed, such as for
Right,
fighter planes
aircraft.
and
Yeah,
yeah, um, that had to be imported from the United States
right.
or from the or from the Middle Eastern oil fields through Iran. They had to import aluminium, copper, bauxite, um, basically high grade, high tensile steel, chromium, and a bunch of other things,
Trucks were a big
including
thing.
trucks. But there's another thing that yeah, trucks were absolutely super important for the for movement on
Radios.
the
Radios were a
uh,
big one. Wire.
yeah, yeah, a wire, especially for telephone lines.
Hmm.
um now people will talk at length about Bedford trucks and Vauxhall trucks and Ford trucks and GMC trucks, right?
Hmm.
But there's this other thing that they don't talk about, which is uh, American and British railway engines and rolling stock, because um, because so the thing, if you look at the map of the Soviet Union runs from west to east, right?
Hmm.
But the rivers of the Soviet Union, they run from uh, uh, in a north-south axis. So the only cheap way of transportation that they had for moving large amounts of goods through through trains, and and trains were absolutely crucial. Yeah, trucks were good, but how do you transport the how do you transport the weapons, the artillery pieces, the tanks from the factories that had been relocated by that time to the east of the Urals,
Hmm.
to the Eastern Front, right? Which was funnily enough about 1,000 miles to the west. So they needed train lines, and it was these train lines which again were imported from from America and the United Kingdom, that allowed them to assemble and move about and transport their military forces from 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 their factories to the battlefront. So so there's that aspect of it as well.
Right. But yeah. So I guess maybe getting back a bit. So there's no evidence. So like, because to me it seems like the narrative is not just like that Britain failed, but that they deliberately carried it out because they're like cartoonishly evil, and that seems to
Yeah,
be like how a lot of the Hindu nationalist narrative about when Britain governed India is like they were
yeah,
just cartoonishly evil for no
yeah.
logical reason.
Well, it isn't exactly the Hindu nationalist thing. It's basically across the spectrum.
Well, isn't it
So
one of the horseshoe
um,
theory things where like
yeah,
liberals
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and Hindu nationalists both kind of agree on it?
yep, that's true. So, funnily enough, though, um, Amartya Sen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Amartya Sen had a series of exchanges with Madhusri Mukherjee in the New York Times, where he said that she seemed satisfied with very little information, and that her data came from only two out of the 27 districts in Bengal. Now, Amartya Sen's own research into the famine, um, which relied on data from a much wider a range of sources, that the the famine harvest in 1943, right,
Mm-hmm.
despite the cyclone in the autumn of the previous year, and despite supplies being cut off from Burma because the Japanese had conquered it, had captured it. Despite everything, there was no actual shortage of food. Okay,
Right.
there was no there was no actual shortage. In fact, the gross amount of food available was significantly higher than in 1941, which was not a famine year. Now, on the ground and in certain places, there was naturally a very substantial shortfall um, compared with demand. This is only to be expected, considering that a war economy had been instituted um, in the colonies and the dominions. Okay,
Right.
but but a relative short so a shortfall of supply relative to demand is a different thing from an absolute shortfall of supply. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
there was no absolute shortfall of supply. Madhusri Mukherjee, she misses that point. She misses that, and in her single-minded desire to just lay the blame on Churchill, she 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 basically ends up focusing on the person rather than on the shortcomings of the system, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
system on the ground in Bengal was actually fucked up. Okay, let's not forget that in the previous year, right, um, Gandhi had started um, the Quit India movement. This was smack in the middle of the war, and Churchill and the British were genuinely very upset, and they had good reason to be, because once a movement of such a magnitude takes place, right, you have it basically paralyzes all of the industrial and urban and administrative centers. So they had their hands full with that. Um, and this contributed towards a later um, confusion in the Bengal government, the Bengal provincial government, because that government was a Muslim-led coalition. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and the people who were in charge of supplying the rice, right? They
Mm-hmm.
engaged in speculation because overwhelmingly they were overwhelmingly Hindu, a non-Bengali Marwari businessmen who engaged in profiteering, and the Muslim-led government, the Muslim League-led government in Bengal, they weren't effective enough to get that thing sorted out. And another thing, the person who should be blamed was the lethargic viceroy, Lord Linlithgow,
Mm-hmm.
who was promptly relieved, pretty soon, early in the early in or was it possibly later in 1943, with Wavell, Wavell. Now, Wavell was a very energetic person, and he soon had the situation in Bengal firmly under control by the middle of 1944. Now, now, in October of 1943, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, Churchill told his new viceroy that he had to ensure that, quote, famine and food difficulties were dealt with, unquote. And on the 8th of October, he said, quote, every effort must be made, even by the diversion of shipping urgently needed for war purposes, to deal with local shortages, unquote. Now, it's true that Churchill refused a Canadian offer of 100,000 of 100,000 tons uh, of of
Yeah, but how are they going to
barley
get
and
it to India
wheat.
from Canada?
Exactly. And in any case, right, even if they were to run the gauntlet of the Atlantic and then transit through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, it would have taken at least 2 months, right?
Would they
At
have done
least
that,
two
or would they
months.
have gone around South Africa?
Oh, no, 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 no. South Africa would have added like 3 more weeks to that. Um, they would have gone through the Mediterranean because the because by 1943 the Italians in the Mediterranean had been neutralized. So
Right.
the Mediterranean was basically free. Now, what happened instead was, early in January of 1944, Bengal had received about one about 130,000 tons of barley from Iraq, from Australia about 180,000 tons of wheat, and a token offer of 10,000 tons from Canada, funnily enough. Um,
Was there any attempt by the Japanese to stop the food shipments from Australia to India?
well, Japanese submarines were in lying in wait in the Bay of Bengal, but this was basically, so it so in short, the Japanese resistance, right, that they offered, it wasn't as bad as it could have been, because by that time, by early 1944, American attacks in the Pacific were stepping up, right? And they had already won the Battle of Midway, and 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 uh, the Battle of Coral Sea, and they had lost very substantial amounts of the Imperial Japanese Navy. So um, now this was the time when the Japanese were very strongly engaged in taking over the European possessions in the Southeast Asian region. So basically, Malaysia had been lost, Singapore had fallen, um, and the Dutch East Indies had, unless I'm mistaken, fallen as
And
well.
Indochina.
Yeah, and and Indochina was under siege. Yeah, siege more like Reed siege, right?
Hmm.
And the Philippines and Guam were being threatened, and had basically fallen really. And there was, but the Americans had through the so the Americans had by the end of 1942, right?
Hmm.
That by the end of 1942, to basically neutralized a very significant portion of the Imperial Japanese Navy's um, power projection capabilities.
Right.
So there was Midway, there was the Battle of the Coral Sea, there was the Guadalcanal campaign, there was the Solomon Islands campaign, and there was there was the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, and finally enough, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands led to the Japanese losing basically they lost about 150 naval pilots. So naval pilots need a lot of they need a lot of training, and they're not as easy to replace as planes are. So the Japanese had their hands full, so they couldn't um, interdict those shipments in in the fag end of 43 and early 44,
Right.
um, as they could have in say 41 or 42.
So maybe just changing the topic a bit. So, what was Gandhi's opinion on World War II and India's involvement in it?
Well, one of the reasons that he launched the Quit India movement was um, that that he was super upset that even participating in the war, right?
Hmm.
Even participating in the war wasn't enough to basically get a um, promise of independence from the British, although effectively that's one of the things that happened. Now, Gandhi and the other nationalist leaders, they felt that India had been involved in the war without the permission of Indians. Now, this was a very natural position for them to take um, because the Muslim League had very loyally supported the war effort in India. Um,
That's interesting.
so yeah,
Did
so
the Muslims tend to have better relations with the British?
generally, I mean, again, I'm I'm generalizing massively,
Yep.
but yes, but yeah, yeah, um,
Because they were a
yeah,
minority in a lot of the country.
yeah.
So the Muslim League supported it. The Hindu nationalists were mixed on it. It kind of depended upon, I guess, whether or not they could get a clear promise of independence from Britain.
So so let me take a quick glance at my notes. Okay, so on the 5th of February in 1942, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Churchill proposed in in his cabinet uh, that he wanted to visit India, um, and he would try to work out a deal with the leaders of the Indian National Congress that India would gain post-war independence, right? In
Mm-hmm.
return for the Indian National Congress to not try to fuck up the war effort in India.
Right.
Churchill himself wanted to do that, but Churchill's cabinet, instead of sending him, sent um, the senior minister who was not from the Conservative Party but from the Labour Party, Sir Stafford Cripps, to India in 42, um, and they sent Cripps because the cabinet knew that Cripps was personally friends with many of the Indian National Congress leaders. Now the Cripps mission, right,
Mm-hmm.
failed because what the Congress leaders wanted was immediate independence, right? Immediate independence, and they said that if you don't give us immediate independence, we will engage in civil disobedience
Well,
against you,
how would that even be
which led.
possible in the middle of a cataclysmic world war?
Look, my country has an average IQ of 85. What do you expect? Like,
Because I
seriously,
mean,
what do you
like
expect?
they would just give India independence, and then like part of the. So sorry, to maybe just take a step back. So what was considered India at the time?
So basically, basically, India plus Pakistan.
Was Burma considered part of India?
That's a good question.
Because whenever I look at it, sometimes Burma is part of the Raj and sometimes it's a separate thing. I don't recall there being any
Sometimes,
real.
sometimes it is.
I don't ever
Okay,
really
so
recall it being listed as a possible part of like a post, like of a independent state. But
yeah, S- so so basically, there's India, right?
mhm.
There's India, there's Pakistan, parts of Afghanistan, Burma, Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, uh, Bhutan. That's basically it, and Sikkim as well. No, sorry, not Sikkim, not Sikkim,
I think it's Sikkim.
but
No,
yeah,
but Sikkim was independent until what, like the 70s or 60s
yeah,
or
yeah,
70s.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, um, basically that. I mean, it would have been they've been like nearly twice as large, and believe me, 50,000 times as worse.
Sorry,
I mean,
was the
imagine.
status of Tibet ambiguous at the time? Because I thought
Um,
Tibet was considered part of
no
China.
Tibet, no Tibet was autonomic, its own autonomous polity. So Tibet existed as basically a theocracy until it was conquered in like what, like 50, like 5051, I think. Invasion of Tibet. Okay, let's see.
Right. No,
In
just I was asking about what was
Yeah, in
considered.
5051.
It wasn't part of the Raj though, or was it considered? I don't think it
It
was.
wasn't part of the Raj, no. No, no.
Um, why is it, just while we're on the topic, that Bhutan and Nepal aren't part of India?
Again, that's a good question. mean, primarily, possibly because Nepal until recently was a monarchy, and um,
Was it just because I
they
know there was a bunch? They didn't remove all the monarchies. I
Nepal
think
Nepal
upon.
Nepal wasn't okay. So Nepal wasn't ever colonized. Okay, it existed as a buffer state between Imperial China,
Hmm.
right, and India. So um, so it formed a an alliance, basically subsidy. Well, I won't say subsidiary alliance because it means something very specific when it comes to talking about the Indian subcontinent. But it formed an alliance where they were essentially subservient to the British
They
Raj
were
in
an
exchange for
independent
protection.
protectorate or something like
Pretty
that.
much, yeah. Pretty much, pretty much, pretty much.
I think also, just if I recall what happened, so when India was granted independence, they didn't revoke any of the prince's titles, right? Like the British did.
No,
They were all
no, that
overthrown by like Hindu
that
nationalists.
didn't. No, not the Hindu nationalists at all. No, it. So the privy purses and the titles weren't uh they weren't revoked until like 72, I think. So the privy purse revoked. When was it abolished? Okay, so in 71.
Oh, some of them lasted that long.
Yeah, basically lasted that long. It changed with the 26th amendment of the Indian Constitution. Fucking accursed piece of shit document.
Wasn't Mysore
I
initially
hate
a
it so
separate
much.
country?
What?
Wasn't Mysore initially separate?
Yeah, yeah. There were like over 500 princely states in 1947.
I think Mysore was
I
like the
mean, the
biggest
funny
though.
thing is, no, that would have been the Nizam of Hyderabad, probably.
Right.
Yeah.
Did it get invaded or was there like some did it was there a coup
It
or
was
something?
it was it was invaded in like 49
Right.
because yeah, because what was the guy's name? It's like Usman Ali Khan under his party of the Razakars, I think, unless I'm mistaken, he held out until like the till the end of 1949,
Right.
and then they were incorporated. So yeah.
So how do Hindu nationalists feel about Gandhi? I'm just kind of curious because I've heard varying things over the years.
Well, Gandhi was killed by a Hindu nationalist. So,
I mean, in the historiography, do they like celebrate his murder, or do they try to be like
um,
we're the real Gandhi or something?
um, not exactly. Okay, so basically, what the the Hindu Nats, formerly of the Hindu Mahasabha and now of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS, they feel that Gandhi had been too accommodating when it came to Muslims during the partition of India.
Right.
So so it's basically what they f- they felt and they continue to feel was Pakistan should never have been created in the first place because it was Gandhi's fault and it was Nehru's fault that they wanted um what was essentially an enemy state on Indian soil, populated by Muslims, and that was this weakness that has prevented the formation of Akhand Bharat, which is, undivided India. So
So that would be India, but include Bangladesh and Pakistan.
yeah, pretty much, yeah. I mean,
Oh, and
for
I guess Sri
fuck's sake,
Lanka. Yeah, and Sri Lanka, I'd
it,
imagine.
yeah, fucking terrible. I mean, India is bad enough as it is. Just think of including fucking Pakistan and Bangladesh in it. Jeez.
Yeah. When did the idea that India should be this like one country thing actually come about?
Um, that's a good question. So, I don't think Nehru and Patel. Um, I don't think Nehru and Patel wanted the princely states to continue existing, because in any case the princely states didn't have um, the economic power, right,
Hmm.
to continue existing as independent polities, and the British government, when they became a so when India was partitioned, right, and India became a dominion, right? And it was a dominion until 1950, when India's constitution was enacted. So during that time, right, that was the buffer transition period that allowed um, Sardar Patel and Nehru to try to reach an understanding with as many of the princely state princes as possible, because since the British had basically annexed them into the Raj, but had allowed them to retain their titles and basically have this thing of privy purses. So a lot of their so a part of their expenses would be maintained um by the Indian and English taxpayers' money. Um, so they had been politically subservient to a subcontinent-wide power for a couple of hundred years, most of them, right? So by that time, right? So by 1947, 48, and 49, none of them had they didn't have the Faustian spirit anymore, in a manner of speaking.
Right.
Um, they didn't want, they didn't have it in them to fight, to offer a challenge, because they were basically told that things would go on as they had been going on. So they would get their money, they would retain their titles. So basically nothing would change for them. So it's just the central administration would change from the Anglos to some jumped up Kashmiri Pandit who thought himself,
Was there
the
like anyone
greatest thing
who
since sliced bread.
suggested India should be independent as its constituent parts?
What?
Like where Marathistan and like Bengal
Um, see,
were separate countries?
I think that probably could work, but you know,
Was that like suggested at
people
the
have
time
been people
or
have been living with what we have for such a long time that I don't think anyone wants to
no, I mean at the time.
embark on. I don't imagine it was actually ever considered.
Oh, okay, just cuz the Raj had been such a
Yeah,
unifying
it had
force.
been. yeah, it had been unifying and mediating influence for such a long time that, as I said, they had basically been they had lost their Faustian spirit. So
Is India pretty decentralized these days?
um, that's a difficult question, but yeah, yeah, because India, it straddles the line between union and federation. So
Right.
I mean, so we have one constitution, but there are lists, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lists regarding which either only the state can make laws, or only the central government can make laws, or concurrent lists in which, you know both governments can make
So
laws. So
maybe, if you'll forgive the anachronism, somewhat like what America used to be like. Um,
um again, still, it's basically what America is now. And
oh, okay.
there and there's just the thing that, India is pretty difficult to rule, because it's like, where would
Well, I
you
mean,
even
every
start,
province
right?
of India could be like one of the largest countries on Earth by itself.
Yeah, yeah.
Like most of the provinces would are larger than probably like just about every European country. Um,
So so West Bengal, right?
mhm.
It has a larger population than um Germany, I think.
Let me
So
just pull
so
this up.
yeah.
Yeah, West
So
Bengal. Uttar
there's like
Pradesh.
what,
What
like
is that
90,
in
it's like 90 million people, I
northwest?
think.
Oh, in northern India. Okay. Yeah, I think that's something like particularly when you get into countries like China. I kind of in India, I kind of view them as worlds unto themselves
Yeah,
because what we would see as states are bigger than uh
most countries.
yeah, most countries, and India has like a whole
Yeah,
bunch of them.
yeah.
So, and they're all very ancient. So,
Uh, Not only are they ancient, but they tend to be very diverse. And yeah, well, diversity, not the, it's not a source of strength here. So yeah.
but I also want to. So, how do you feel? So, I'd imagine kind of in your case, you have to have kind of mixed feelings about the whole thing because you're a very conservative guy, but the social conservatives in India are almost all Hindu nationalists. Or am I wrong in saying that?
By far, no, you are absolutely correct. So it's
Whereas
either
you,
so it's either Hindu nationalists, or you have Muslims. And yeah, yeah,
I
there's
mean,
there's
in
no
like you're Catholic, and I'd imagine the INC is a lot more religiously tolerant towards Christians.
the Indian National Congress.
Yes.
Well, the Indian National Congress's official position is secularism. So it's tolerant in the way that, European secular powers in Scandinavia are tolerant. So yeah,
They're
or
less
in
because I'd imagine
or in
like
the same way or in the same way that the Democrats are tolerant. So it's tolerant only to the extent, or only to the degree that the interests don't clash. So back in the 70s, the um, Indian National Congress, when they embarked, when Mrs. Gandhi, when Indira Gandhi and her son, Sanjay Gandhi, embarked on this mass project of introducing contraception and forced vasectomies during the emergency period. So between 75 and 77, um, the Catholics in Kerala, right?
Hmm.
They basically rolled over. So only the Muslims offered um, a resistance, and none of the Hindu well, they did make a bit of noise, but mostly the religious reaction was very tepid.
Hmm.
So yeah, so there's no such thing called conservatism in the sense that we know it, in the sense that you and I would like it in in India. So
No, I'm just saying, like, because I'd imagine, like, the Hindu nationalists are much, like, I don't know how, like, actively oppressive they are as of Christians, but I imagine they
oh
actively despise them.
oh they are they
Whereas the
do.
INC is, like, paused, but it's not at, like, specifically anti-Christian, if that makes sense, is my understanding.
Yeah, yeah. So the Hindu nationalists are super anti-Christian. They have often involved themselves in killing Christians. So yeah.
But on socialist, I'm just saying, it's got to be kind of a hard position for you because I'd imagine you're a lot closer to them on most social issues, but they hate your guts. Whereas the pause
Oh yeah,
people don't hate you as much, but they support like shit that you find objectionable. If I'm,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, the only problem with the Hindu Nats is that they're Hindu, basically.
Right, because like how I feel when I look at it is I kind of like, and this is just maybe as an ignorant Westerner, I kind of like Modi and the BJP because aren't they like fairly socially conservative, like meaningfully so?
No,
No, they aren't.
not.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it doesn't make sense. Again, as I said, it doesn't make much sense to talk about ideology in an Indian context.
Okay.
So it's not so social conservatism, right? It
Hmm.
doesn't exist independently of my Hindu kingdom, right?
Right.
It doesn't exist independently of that. So there's no equivalent to let's say even a very a lukewarm conservative figure like Roger Scruton. There's no equivalent to a Roger Scruton of of lamented memory in India. Does that make sense?
Um. Yeah. So what we would call social conservatism is just Hindu nationalism, and there's not like a concept of it beyond
Yeah,
just Hindu nationalism.
yeah. So for example, I mean social conservatism would you would have expected the Christians to have come up with something equivalent to it, right?
I'd actually say no because they're a religious minority. And kind of as with
And
Jews or Muslims, pushing social liberalism is more useful to them than um
yeah, well, um, so the thing about the Catholics and the Protestants um in India is that they're just paused. They're just so paused that it's just so depressing
I find a
when you
lot
go.
of Christians in certain third world countries have a big notice me senpai um
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
thing. Like a lot of
yeah.
Lebanese I think are like that. I know like one of the funny ones is when Shinzo Abe was prime minister of Japan. He was very conservative, but his wife, who was Catholic, was like really pro gay marriage and was trying to like bully him into doing it. Um,
Yeah, yeah. There's a so I think this is especially an issue in India because um, now that the so one of the things that most Indians are unable to conceive of is Christianity that's not Anglo, right?
mhm,
So the vast majority of people in India, they don't know that the Catholic Church is in Italy, right?
right.
That it's headquartered in Italy, or that there's Orthodox Church in Greece or Russia or Syria
Hmm.
or in the Ukraine. So basically, the idea of Christianity amongst the vast majority of people in India is that it's tied, it's ineluctably tied to um, the Anglican Church and to the not that they know it's the Anglican Church, that the that the culture that accompanies their conception of Christianity is in a way um, what the Anglican Church is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, yeah, I understand. It's
So
yeah.
what happens when um what
Oh,
happens
sorry
when
if I could
this
just interject. It's kind of like how the Japanese, I think, understandably saw Christianity as, to a certain extent, being a tool of the Dutch and Spanish to try to gain
yeah
political
yeah
power over
pretty much yeah
Japan.
pretty much yeah
Hmm.
pretty much pretty much uh there's so historical knowledge in India has never been particularly widespread,
Hmm.
and it and such isn't the case now. So you don't have you don't have a population that is possessed of subtle distinctions um, in theology. So the majority of people don't know how um, sects in Christianity work, or even that there are sects in the first place. So yeah, most people will associate late imperial Anglo culture with Christianity, and because such is the case, right?
Hmm.
Um, yeah, it's just difficult to let people know that there are that there's an alternative to this.
I mean, that's always the problem when I look at countries like Iran or Turkey or any kind of Muslim country. Because, like, when I think about the Christian population there, the, like, paused left is going to be more tolerant and less oppressive, but they're going to push all kinds of, like, really evil shit on the society in
Yeah,
general.
yeah.
Whereas I think my thing is moderate Islamism is better than secularism, but secularism is better than like radical Islamism. I think is how my chart goes. Like in Turkey, for instance, I never know like who I would vote for if I lived there. Um, I'd probably actually vote for Erdogan, to be perfectly
Okay,
honest.
let me let me send you let me send you a link.
Okay.
So yeah, so I've sent it to you, right?
Hmm.
So Kerala Catholics at ease with abortion. Okay, so let me. read it out to you if that's okay.
Okay. You can just. I'm just gonna put this up.
So it begins. So this is dated to November 28th, 2012. Um, While the Catholic Church across the world opposes abortion and birth control, in Kerala, which has the largest Catholic community in India, it is over 2 million, by the way, birth control is a way of life, with couples widely adopting abortion as a means of birth control. Kerala's Catholics are arguably the most prosperous community, not just in Kerala, but likely they're amongst the top five most prosperous communities across India. In terms of wealth, education, number of professionals, representation in the administration, and the capacity to influence government policies, has been enthusiastic about birth control as a means to a better future for the family for decades. Many commentators have pointed out that the small family norm had helped the Christian community achieve its current educational advancements as the small family could focus its attention and resources on educating fewer offspring. Better education coupled with other factors helped the community scale social and economic heights. A better empowerment of Christian women through education and employment than of women in other communities has been a direct offshoot of smaller families. So there's this guy, um, Alphonse Kananthanam, the former IAS officer and former member of legislative assembly, says that the Catholic community had long back adopted the government's um, family planning and birth control measures wholeheartedly and has benefited from them. He told the Hindu, which is the name of the newspaper that this article was published in, that the Catholics in Kerala were much more receptive to family planning and birth control than any other community in the country. He recalled that family planning had been most successful in Kottayam district, which had the largest Catholic population amongst all the 14 districts in Kerala. So he says, while I was the collector of Kottayam, so collector is the kind of magistrate, overlooks tax collection.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so he says, while I was the collector of Kottayam for 4 years, I received the most support from Catholics in implementing family planning programs. Despite the strong stand taken by the Vatican against birth control, the different Catholic rites in Kerala had been lukewarm about it as the community as a whole favored small families. Now, so there are like only so there's the Syro Malabar rite and the Latin rite and the Syro Malankaran rite in Kerala.
Mm-hmm.
So he said, though the Catholics attend church every Sunday and revere the Pope, when it comes to economic decision making, they go by their own economic interests. Since fewer children make better economic sense, they naturally took to family planning and birth control in a big way. This is so fucking disgusting. Healthcare professionals point out that the number of abortions being done in Kerala hospitals is very high. Married women seek abortions for spacing childbirths and for employment reasons. Those statistics are hard to come by. One source said that in her experience, Christian married women had an edge in those seeking abortion. This was for reasons of higher education, employment, and job prospects abroad. The huge majority of educated or employed women in Kerala, with not much divergence between religions these days, want to put an end to their fertility um, after their second child is born. I invariably get a request from middle class wives to quote get it stopped unquote before they entered the labor room. A gynecologist said.
Mm-hmm.
So the Kerala Catholic Church, which had earlier soft pedaled its stance on abortions and birth control, started taking a fresh view from the late 1990s. One reason was the aggressive campaigning undertaken by the Vatican since 1995, and the other, much more important reason was demographics. Church authorities noticed that in spite of the increasing prosperity and social visibility of Christians, their population was slowly shrinking. Census figures showed that the rate of growth of the Catholic population was below the replacement level. The church was directly hit by the falling population. It found it hard to find children willing to become priests and nuns. The Kerala Catholic Bishops' Council has taken several steps to buck the trend. Advocacy, incentives for couples opting for more children, and children's education support. It asked Catholic run hospitals not to carry out abortion and discourage family planning of operations. To step up the campaign, the council has set up a pro life movement under its family commission. Okay. In the aftermath of Savita Halaparvan's death in an Ireland hospital, serves her well. By the way,
Hmm.
you you kill your child, you die yourself. That's justice. So
Hmm.
I have no problem with that. Um,
Sorry, just a side note. Aren't Hindu nationalists are more pro-life, right?
they do tend to be super pro life. Although, yeah. So there are places, there are certain Hindu villages in Uttar Pradesh, right?
Hmm.
That that have a that have fertility rates of like 5 or 6 or 7 sometimes.
Right.
So, yeah, so that's pretty good. And Hindu nats have generally um, encouraged people to have a lot of kids, so as to not um, so as to not be replaced by the Muslims. So Father Paul Thelakat, right?
Hmm.
co- a consulting editor of Satya Deepam and spokesperson for the Synod of Bishops of the Syro Malabar Church, told The Hindu, which is the newspaper, that the church considered abortion a sin. But abortion could take place while treating the mother to save her life. This surely is not sinful, he said. Had the people concerned followed Catholic morality, Savita's life could perhaps have been saved. Father Telakar, however, regretted that the church was being faulted for Savita's death. It is sad and unfortunate that the Catholic Church's morality is being attacked on account of her death. Okay, so if I ever meet this guy, I'm gonna fucking kick his ass. What a fucking piece of shit. Dasa.
Right.
So this is what the guy looks like. This is the Paul Telakat character.
He kind of reminds me of someone. I'm not sure who, but um,
Yeah, there's like 500 million of his kind in India, so I'm pretty sure he's gonna look like someone.
but yeah. So that's too bad. What are the What are the Protestants in India like?
The Protestants are pretty much paused and they're going out of existence, more or less. So,
Oh, but
yeah.
aren't they like the majority in some states?
Yeah, but they're not the they're not the established Protestant churches. So, ever since the
Oh, I was
1990s,
including like
unless I'm mistaken.
evangelicals and Pentecostals.
Oh, yeah, so ever since the 1990s, there's been a huge surge of Pentecostals and evangelicals in the northeastern states of India. So, if you count them, then that places um, them in I think, or are the Catholics in the majority? The Catholics, I think, are in the majority. Yeah, so um there's basically no way of saving the church in India. You just need new people.
Mm-hmm.
Just need new people. There's just no, yeah.
So as I said, I guess that puts you in a very difficult position.
Yeah. I will pretty much have to abandon India at some point. It's yeah, yeah, it's, yeah. It's just yeah. I don't know. It's depressing. It's depressing to think,
Well,
but
I know how you feel. I live in Canada, and it's
yeah,
well, the Catholic Church here is pretty bad. I don't know if it's as bad as India. Something what Catholic churches tend to do in the West is they'll be ultra liberal on every issue except for abortion because it's completely irrelevant. Because
yeah,
it's never none of that is ever going to change in Canada or America. So they can be nominally pro life as like a defense if people accuse them of stuff. But on like every
yeah.
other issue, like I was telling our mutual friend Terrellian like about how I went to a Christmas concert once at a Jesuit college and they started by having a moment of silence for Turtle Island. I don't know if you're aware of Turtle Island.
Sounds vaguely familiar. Can you tell me about it?
So Amerindians or Aboriginals or whatever you want to call them in North America believe that the continent is on the back of a giant turtle, and it's
Mm-hmm.
taught as like objective history. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was taught that way in when I was in university. Um,
Okay.
so
Oh. I think I know what you mean. I think I know what you mean. Sounds vaguely familiar. Yeah.
it's really gay, like extremely. Um,
Yeah.
but that's just the kind of stuff that we have to deal with here. And I remember when I was at church last week, they were talking about stolen Amerindian land is a very common thing. So it's just like
Uh,
so.
yeah.
Muslims are as bad though. I don't think people like Muslims are really liberal in North America, for the most part.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah. So, anyways,
Well,
I think that
well,
covers. Oh, sorry.
Marcon. I'm saying the president of France wanted them to be Republicans, so they became Republicans. So yeah. Yeah, I'm talking about the Muslims. So yeah, so basically they wanted them to integrate, and so they integrated. Damned if you do, damned if you don't, I guess.
Hmm. Well, I think that covers about everything I wanted to talk about. Thanks for coming on, man. Hopefully, some people
Yeah,
in the
sure.
audience found that interesting. Um,
Yeah,
I'll try to have Serp on again sometime soon. It's just difficult because he's busy and I'm busy. Um,
and maybe we can, you know, talk with Serpenter and Tyrion together. Maybe.
okay, maybe I'll have you guys on to talk about cryptids sometime soon.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thanks for coming on, man. Have a good day, or I
Sure.
guess night
You
in
too.
case. Yeah. Anyways, guys, hope you enjoyed that. Something a little bit different. More exciting.